Back when you were learning to count and add and subtract numbers, you probably worked with number blocks such as this. On the left, I have what I'm going to call a positive 1 unit block. Anything in yellow will be positive. And on the right, in red, anything in red will be a negative 1 unit block. And we call it a 1 unit block because the area of the square is 1. And we can think of the side lengths as being a 1 by 1 square, and therefore the area is 1, which is why we call it a 1 unit block. Alright, so now that we're going to start studying algebra a little bit more deeply, in order to help us understand it and how it works, we're going to use some other shapes. And the next one I have is a strip, a rectangle that measures 1 unit by x units. And so the area of this strip is x times 1, or x units. And so this strip would be what we call an x unit block, and in red, a negative x unit block. And one more we're going to use. A square that measures x units by x units, and so its area is x squared. A positive x squared block is shown here, and a negative x squared in red block is shown here. And these are all called algebra tiles, and we're going to use them to visualize algebraic expressions and help us understand how we can work with them. So here I have a collection of algebra tiles, and what I'm going to do is write out symbolically what I have. I have 2 positive x squared blocks, so that's 2x squareds. I have 3 x strip blocks, so that's plus 3x. And I have a negative 1 unit block, so that's negative 1. And this expression, represented by these tiles, is what we call a polynomial. So a polynomial, I'm just going to read this definition slowly. A polynomial is the sum, or the adding or subtracting together of one or more terms. Terms are sections that are separated by plus or minus signs. So this polynomial has 3 terms, and the terms have variables that have whole number exponents. So in term 1, the exponent on the variable is a 2, which is a whole number. 3x, the exponent on the x is a 1, that's a whole number. And then we have just the plain old 1 at the end that has no variable at all. That's what we call a polynomial. The adding and subtracting together of terms whose variables have whole number exponents. Just to define a little bit more closely what we mean by terms, I said there's sections that are separated by plus or minus signs, and terms are made up of numbers, variables, or numbers and variables that are multiplied together, the product of numbers and variables. The next term that we have here is talking about what we mean by the degree of a term. So we have 3 terms in our polynomial, as I said, and what we mean by the degree of a term in one variable, so we have our polynomial in terms of x, one variable. The degree of the term is the value of the exponent of the variable. So in term 1 here, the value of the exponent on the variable is 2. So term 1 has degree 2. Term 2, the exponent on the variable is a 1, so that's got degree 1. And the last term has no variable, so it is of degree 0. Degree 2 for the first term, degree 1 for the second term, degree 0 for the third term. And then we have another term that talks about what do we mean by the degree of the polynomial. It is simply the largest of the degrees of any term. And since that number is 2, we say that the degree for this polynomial above is degree 2. And the final word I want you to know is constant term. that's the term that doesn't change value. In other words, it has no variable. That's -1 in our polynomial above. And as we can see, the constant term always has a degree 0. You can think of the constant term as being written as -1 times x to the 0. 0 being the exponent on the variable. And the reason I write it as x to the 0 is because we know that x to the 0 is 1. So the constant term has degree 0. A couple more words. We have special names for polynomials that have 1 term, 2 terms, or 3 terms. If it has 1 term, we call it a monomial. Here's an example of a monomial, 3x squared. That's 1 unit, all multiplied together, so that's 1 term. -x would be 1 term. Just a number, that would be a 1-term polynomial called a monomial. A 2-term polynomial is called a binomial. So 2x plus 3, that's 2 terms. Or x squared minus 7, that's 2 terms. Terms separated by a plus or minus sign. And 3 terms, not surprisingly, called a trinomial. X squared plus 4x minus 1, 3 terms, a trinomial. Finally, you might be wondering what would be an example of something that is not a polynomial, keeping in mind that our definition of polynomial is the adding or subtracting together of terms in which the variables have whole number exponents. What would be examples of something that is not a polynomial? Something like 2 divided by x. If you have a variable in the denominator, that is not a polynomial. And here's why. You could write 2 over x as 2x to the -1, and then the exponent on the variable is not a whole number. It's an integer. Here's another common example. The square root of x is not a polynomial because, as you'll learn later, the square root of x can be written as x to the 1/2, and the exponent on the x then is also not a whole number. It's a rational number.